Oh, look, we're live now. It's amazing. Technology is amazing.
How about that?
Oh, so hi, I'm Louis Porter Jr., and please let me introduce.
We're live now. It's amazing. Technology is amazing.
Hi.
Oh, so hi, I'm Louis Porter Jr., and please let me introduce.
Nothing delay in my own head.
We're live now. It's amazing. Technology is amazing.
Oh, this is going to drive me crazy right now.
Hi, I'm Louis Porter Jr., and please let me introduce. Delay in my own head.
Hi.
It's going to drive me crazy. Yeah, this is hilarious.
It's really good. This is really good.
Yeah, this is going like the best.
It's really good. It's really good.
Okay, I'm going to have to get my headphones. You can start laughing at it. All right.
Live on the internet. Does that help? I can't. Now I can't. Hold on. But now I can't hear you at all, Louis. Mm-mm. I can't hear you, Louis. Maybe the audience can hear me. I have no idea. I'm being totally transparent with you now. We seem to have some technology problem here. Should work. I can try to throw on some headphones if that might help. Hello?
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Wow, that was a lot of...
Hey! Hi, Louis.
Hello. Just hoping there's no echo that pops up again. Okay.
No, that I think was my fault, actually. I had the YouTube link you sent me earlier was up in a different tab. So.
Oh, well, that's always fun.
That was my fault.
This is why live is awesome. Live is the best. Okay. So,
Yeah.
So, could you please introduce yourself after that lovely fiasco?
Sure. Hi, I'm Erik Mona. I am the publisher and chief creative officer at Paizo Incorporated. We make Pathfinder role-playing game. I'm working on Starfighter role-playing game, Pathfinder adventure card game, and a few other things along the way.
Well, that's the basic stuff you're doing. Let's talk about the comic stuff. I mean, let's talk about the important stuff. Everybody knows about your...
Oh, you want to talk about the comic stuff?
Yeah, come on. Everybody knows your gaming stuff. I mean, let's talk about the good stuff.
It's all good stuff, my friend.
Well, okay. Let's see how you got. Let's find out from the beginning. How did you get started with comics in general?
Boy, do you mean like how did I get started reading comic books, like as a child?
All the way from the
Well, I was always into probably the Spider-Man cartoon as a little kid. You know, that does whatever a spider can, catches crooks just like flies, like that version of Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And I think I read comics based on that. At a certain point when I was a little kid, my dad, who was a big baseball card collector, purchased a comic book collection from somebody somehow. And so that is when I finally became like a comic book collector. We got this big collection of comics. I think I'd been reading like early G.I. Joe comics or something as a kid. But like that was like my first delve. That had a whole bunch of Silver Age stuff in it. I lost that collection about 2-3 years later in a big flood that destroyed our house. And so now as an adult, I think back to the stuff that was in that collection, and it was a lot of Silver Age stuff, and it was a lot of like, I remember it had a complete run of Jack Kirby's Commandy and like a bunch of old Brave and the Bolds and stuff. And so it was like 70s comics, probably, I would say, late 70s comics all the way up to like mid 80s. And so I loved it. You know, it really, I think getting to see the world kind of beyond Superman and Batman and Spider-Man, you know, how weird comics could get, really appealed to me. And yeah, basically the rest is history. Incidentally, that comic book collection also had a long box filled with D&D stuff. And I was just dabbling with D&D at the same time. And I remember actually being a little bit more intrigued at the time by the one D&D box than like the 10 comic long boxes that I'd gotten. And that was where I got my first copies of Dragon Magazine. That was what really kind of ignited the spark that made me want to become a professional magazine editor. But, you know, I read those comics and then been a comic collector my whole life pretty much since then. And when we launched our own comic line with Dynamite for Pathfinder, finally had an opportunity to write comics as well.
So you wanted to be a magazine editor. I'm kind of surprised. I didn't, you know.
Yeah, that was my dream, Lewis, from day one, pretty much. You know, I got those issues of Dragon, and they were some of the best issues that you could get. I mean, they were the Ed Greenwood 9 Hells articles, like in 74, 75, 79, somewhere in there, issues, not the year. And I was just so intrigued by that magazine that I think that was the first moment. You know, there were a lot of editorials in that era that were signed by Kim Mohan and Roger Moore, and I thought, you know, these are guys whose voice carries through in the content that they're selecting for the magazine. Their editorials were always really interesting to me. And so I quickly identified that that was like a job associated with, you know, D&D, which was this hobby that I was into from the very beginning. And so I was really inspired to become the editor of Dragon, like from, I'd say, about 3rd grade. And from that point forward, almost every extracurricular activity decision that I made, college decisions, work, professional stuff like that, was all geared toward making me a better candidate to edit Dragon Magazine, and I got to edit Dragon Magazine, in fact. And so that was pretty sweet. And yeah, so that first comics thing was also kind of the first taste of the idea of being a professional gamer, albeit, you know, as far as a 11-year-old kid, you know, could process it. Yeah.
So, you know, let's just ask an important question: DC, Marvel, or independent? Which one are you more of a fan?
Well, the answer to that question would, I think, vary depending on what era, you know, you were talking about. And I don't mean era in the comics as much as I mean era just in my life. You know, when I started, I think a DC, I was not really into DC. I think Teen Titans was pretty much the only thing good coming out of DC in like the early 80s, at least in my opinion at the time. And so I was much more interested in Marvel because I was really into Chris Claremont X-Men, you know, when that was the hottest book. I really, you know, was into, I mean, I really started comics reading G.I. Joe, to be honest, you know, as one of the earlier comics that I read. And so I really liked that as a kid. And but then as things went on, about 1985, I was lucky enough to, as a 6th grade kid, you know, in this sort of under-the-table operation, I worked at a comic book store as a you know, preteen. And what they had me and a little friend do is we came in over the weekend and we alphabetized all their comics. We looked up the prices on all their comics, sorted all their comics, bagged all their comics, and just kind of ran their back issue departments. This is at a place called Schinders in Crystal, Minnesota. And I worked there for a couple of summers, basically every weekend, working full days, pricing, reading comics, and then we were paid because it was illegal, we were paid in comics, and so as a young kid, I was loading up on back issues of stuff like What If, Marvel Team Up, some of the just weird old comics, or I guess I should say sort of early Bronze, late Silver Age comics. And that really instilled in me a lot of interest in like the history of comics. And I got quite knowledgeable about the various miniseries and things because, of course, I was pricing all the comics all the time. And the ones that caught my eye, they're usually $1 a piece, $2 a piece. You can take home a nice little haul for a 6th grade kid, for working an 8-hour day. And, luckily I was working in a comic shop in 1985, 1986, which meant I was working on a weekly basis when Dark Knight Returns came out, when Watchmen came out, when Who's Who came out, when Crisis on Infinite Earths came out, when Secret Wars came out, when Guide to the Marvel Universe, all that stuff. Oh, and the TSR Marvel RPG. All that stuff was dropping kind of within that same period of time I was working in a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was another one, So I saw all that stuff happening kind of in real time, I remember a couple other storylines I remember from the era were like the death of Superman, that great Alan Moore 2-parter that kind of ended the Silver Age Superman, right. And then the John Byrne Superman series was kind of happening at the same time. I think the George Perez Wonder Woman was happening roughly around the same time because that was all kind of coming out of Crisis and then maybe into the Legends era. And the whole, I remember the big one that was like we talked about the most probably at the time was like the big Hobgoblin reveal. It's like Ned Leeds is the Hobgoblin. Oh my God! And that was mind melting. So like in terms of trying to pick a 2-year era in the 80s for a little kid to work in a comic book store, I got to go with like 84 to 86. That was a really good time.
Yeah.
To turn somebody into a huge comic book nerd. And what ended up happening is I fell in love with Crisis on Infinite Earths. I really was obsessed with DC Comics as a kid. One of the early comics that I got was an oversized reprint of All-Star Comics #3, which was the introduction of the Justice Society of America. And I got that before I was even really much of a comic book fan. And I was really intrigued by like, wait, so there's a Green Lantern who wears like a red shirt and he's blonde, and there's a Flash who wears a weird helmet. What? How? And so when Crisis happened, it was like, oh, here's the story behind the multiverse, essentially. And I've always been fascinated by the multiverse idea, as has been portrayed in D&D and in Michael Moorcock's books and then, just Pathfinder and everything, and DC was really putting a lot of focus on that in 1985 with Crisis, and at the same time releasing their Who's Who books, which kind of gave you the skinny on all the different characters. And so I think it was probably then that I became sort of an armchair expert in DC continuity and was really a DC fan on and off ever since. And I wouldn't say that I never read Marvel comics, but I'd say the last Marvel comic that I read with any real regularity was probably Grant Morrison when he was on X-Men, about 8 or 9 years ago.
Yeah, I can see we're basically probably about the same age since we're basically, I remember the stories you just said. Hey, I remember that. I was working for comics. Yeah, that's how I got my Iron Man run.
Oh, sweet. Yeah. Now, Iron Man, oddly enough, Iron Man's a character I've never really followed. He's cool. I have nothing against him, but like, I don't know that much about Iron Man.
I would say with the tech, I'm a big sci-fi tech head, so it was like, oh, what can we do with cool armor? So, and that just that played over, I guess, the rest of my life. I always said that science fiction is interesting to me because I can kind of feel it. While fantasy, it's not real, but it is real. It's just science fiction by a different name.
Yeah, and I mean, just speaking of Iron Man, a lot of those, when DC was doing Who's Who, then Marvel was doing that Guide to the Marvel Universe comic. And as I recall, that thing would break down like, here's the Type 1, Type 2, right. Here's the mock armor, and definitely looking at all the different Iron Man armor suits, going back to the beginning, it was like, oh, this is pretty cool, And I love comics that have like, here's a cross section of the Batcave, and you can see like, oh, there's the Penny, and there's the Tyrannosaurus, and all that. I love that stuff.
It's it's definitely one of those things. It's because of the time period, the information was so readily available and so cool, and you didn't see that before. I mean, when the
there was no internet where you could just look that stuff up, Right. And even then, I think So you're thinking like mid-'80s, modern comics are only 14, 15 years old, or is that right? About 20 years old, maybe. If you go back to 61 I think that's when Flash of Two Worlds came out, right? So that's like the birth of the Silver Age, essentially.
Yeah, basically like 50. That's like latest.
Fantastic 50. Four is like 1963, I think, or something. So the Marvel's younger than 25 years old at that point in terms of their modern continuity. DC is kind of in the same boat, and things are just starting to get complex enough that it's all starting to fall apart. But they're still simple enough that you could be like, oh, here's the story with Spider-Man. He's Peter Parker, he's bitten by a radioactive spider. He's in high school. There's not multiple versions of Spider-Man. The Spider-Man in 1982 is the same character as the Spider-Man in 1965, And so I think that what the comic book companies were trying to do is they didn't have an internet either. And so they're trying to be like, wait, let's get our own story straight. Let's do Who's Who as like a Bible of our characters for DC. And let's figure out some of the continuity. I mean, that's really what Crisis was all about. And so, even the writers and stuff at DC, I think, didn't, unless you'd collected every comic, how would you even know some of that stuff? Right. So it was like rare esoteric knowledge at that time. Now you can just look it up on the internet, and that's great. But there was that special something about being able to be like, I know everything there is to know about Ultra Boy or whatever,
Because I think they were just, well, first of all, they were well researched, which was amazing. Like,
yeah.
They did. And it was just, and the art was always great with it too. I think that always helped out. And that period too, the 80s, were a great period of great artists, great stories. We're going to tell some adult stuff with, Legends of Dark Knight and Watchmen.
Yeah.
It's like that time period probably can't ever be replicated ever.
Pretty exciting. It's an interesting transition of like from the Silver Age goofy optimism stuff into the more modern age, more kind of adult stuff. But like they were still telling those adult stories with characters that were kind of iconic.
Right.
Now it's like, New 52, for example. It's like, well, they could tell some interesting stories, but it's like the 9th version of Batman. You know what I mean? It's not quite the same as saying, like when Alan Moore wrapped up the Silver Age Superman and the stories we were just talking about, the Death of Superman stories, that was Superman. That wasn't like a fake version of Superman. That was the Superman that had gone back pretty much from the very beginning. So it's like, I don't know. I'm probably parsing things in a way that shouldn't be parsed, but it felt like they were playing with like the real versions of the characters. And now it's like, they can still tell very compelling stories and all that, but it's, kind of photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy.
Right. And my thing is that I always say they won't kill anybody. No one, Bruce Wayne initially was supposed to be the world's greatest detective.
Yeah.
Now he's the world's greatest martial artist. Now he's the most greatest. And it's like they kept adding on to what he was. And
that they have to, to keep things interesting. And it's like, the Superman issue too is it's like, okay, and now he's married and now he has a kid and now he's this and he's that. And it's like, well, at a certain point, the development that you've done to keep the character interesting has taken it away from kind of what made the character special in the first place. And not in every case, but in many cases. And so, yeah, it's a little bit different. I don't think you can recapture that, Bronze Age thing.
Yeah, well, some of the characters are, 70 years old.
Well, and some of the characters are much more interesting now, and it's like, then they're not all white, which is nice. Like there's things that they're important things that have happened. I don't want to just sit here and just basically be like, oh, yay, nostalgia. Like there are things that I much prefer about comics now than in the 80s.
Yeah, I also the thing I do not prefer is the price versus, what you're getting. I always feel like, I go back to my same argument, I've said it millions of times, it's hard for a mother of 3 to pick up comic books for, 3 kids.
Well, I think with several important exceptions. I think comics aren't for kids anymore. Comics are for 40-year-old dudes.
Yeah.
And increasingly 40-year-old women or younger women. I think they are trying now to address some demographic issues that they've had in the past with the aging of their audience, with just being a very monolithic demographic of comic book guys, essentially, and so some of that's changing, but a kid, I have to imagine a $4 comic, maybe the kid gets 1 or 2, we used to be able to get 3 or 4, and so there's a difference for sure.
Yeah. And I love comics. I always have. I think it's one of the greatest mediums ever made, but I want to get more people into it, because I always think that the comics were the gateway for me to get into gaming. And I went back to like, oh, look at these old TSR ads. Hey, what's this game? What's this Dungeons and Dragons game?
Totally.
And people would be playing it, and I'm like, oh, what's that? And I always that was my direct connection because I
loved those D&D ads with the adventuring party that were like Bill Willingham comic stories. In fact, when we did the Age of Worms adventure path back in Dungeon, the rival adventuring party that's like racing you to all the different locations is the party from those ads. So I brought those characters back, just for fun, really.
See, that's the best part. Also, the enjoyability of it all and that fun part. So okay, so now you're in charge, and you say, I want to do a comic book,
right?
And then you decide, how can I make it cooler? What's the theme I need to go with? And of course, like most people, you go look at Crisis and go, I think this could work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little more complicated than that in that, my first goal with the teaming up with Dynamite a few years ago was just to have a Pathfinder comic. We'd wanted to tell the stories of our iconic characters for a long, long time, and I'd always thought that a comic book was the appropriate place to do that, or one appropriate place to do that. And so we always wanted a comic. For the first year or two of Pathfinder, that was just more of a dream. It's like, well, really what I wanted was to be able to put out Pathfinder number 6. I wasn't like, my concerns were much more immediate than let's do a comic, let's start a media empire, in 2008. So it wasn't really until, I would say, about 2010, when we put out the Advanced Player's Guide, and Pathfinder started becoming Pathfinder instead of just sort of like the latest version of D&D, essentially, that people started being really interested more in Pathfinder as the brand, and at that point it was like, okay, maybe, there are people who are coming to that don't even play D&D, they come to the hobby through Pathfinder, and those people want comics, and they want novels and all that, and that's when things kind of blew up in terms of like different expressions beyond the RPG of some of these characters. So my first goal really was just, let's tell the stories of the iconic characters. And Dynamite, worked with us, and Jim Zub, who we'd worked with a lot on the magazines, actually, because he used to help manage an art studio called Udon, and we used them for a lot of our art. So Jim was kind of our contact guy. So we knew Jim going way back. Jim had been doing Skull Kickers, which is a great independent fantasy comic, and we knew he'd be a good voice for the comic. And brought him on board, and pretty much at about the time that I was able to move on and say, okay, we've got a comic now, then I started like getting more involved with Dynamite and started realizing like, okay, so Dynamite's got a series that crosses over all their pulp heroes, and that's called Masks, and it's got like Doc Savage and the Shadow and the Spider and those types of characters. And then they've got, they had just done, basically what pushed it into high gear was I saw an ad for a comic that they did called Legendary that was by Bill Willingham, and it was like a steampunk team-up. And it had like steampunk versions of Red Sonja and Flash Gordon and some other things. And so I thought, Dynamite's teaming up, they've got like a steampunk team-up, and they've got a pulp era, pulp hero team-up. They've done something else called Project Superpowers. It was like a public domain superhero team-up. And so I'm like, Dynamite seems to like doing team-ups, and this contract I signed with them to do the series had all kinds of rules about if we ever crossover characters. So I'm like, let's just put that into practice, and I started suggesting to them that they do a fantasy crossover, and basically it took a while, with all the different rights holders and stuff, it took a while to line everything up, but here we are, and Pathfinder Worldscape, our big fantasy crossover comic, comes out October 19th, and I'm writing it.
It's kind of crazy. It's like, you're...
Yeah. I think it was just an issue of like, I was driving the idea so much, and then, Jim did 3 story arcs for us, and then his docket got really full with work for Marvel, and he's like a rocket taking off right now in the comics business, and so he was going to have to move on from the book, and so we started looking around and say, well, who do we want to get to write this? And the kind of triumvirate of myself, Wes Schneider, and James Sutter, our editor-in-chief and executive editor here at Paizo, we're like, why don't we try writing some scripts? So we did some scripts for like first the Pathfinder Goblin series. And then we did a couple of issues each for the Pathfinder Origin series and Pathfinder Hollow Mountain, which is just out in hardcover now. And so that by the time it was like, okay, Worldscape is the next series, who's going to write it, I think Dynamite looked around and they're like, well, this is kind of Erik's project, and Erik can prove he can write a comic, so let's have him do it. So right. I'm really honored to be able to get the opportunity, not just to kind of launch this thing behind the scenes, but also to get to script the adventures of not just, the iconic characters that we co-created, but characters created by, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert E. Howard, and Frank Frazetta. It's just like a dream come true.
So out of all the characters in Worldscape, who's your favorite? I mean, non-Paizo. Who's your favorite?
That's a good question, and it's funny because in addition to it's not who you might think. So, like, in addition to the characters from the Edgar Rice Burroughs estate, in addition to the characters from Red Sonja, Dynamite was like, why don't you look around and see if there's any sort of public domain fantasy not superheroes, but fantasy heroes you might want to incorporate into your story. And I thought, okay, and I knew immediately which one I wanted to do, and that's this bizarre 1941 jungle hero called Phantoma. I don't know if you're familiar with Phantoma, but Phantoma is my favorite character that I'm dealing with here. Phantoma is a character. She's one of the first female protagonists in comics, I believe, and she's certainly one of the first female superheroes in that she has just ridiculous, over-the-top powers. She's like, I'm using her basically as a goddess in the comic because she's so omnipotent and so powerful. And what she is she's this beautiful woman who looks a little bit like Veronica Lake wandering around in the jungle. Okay. And when she gets angry, her skin turns blue and her face turns into a skull. It still has long blonde hair. She's still got a beautiful woman's body, but she's got this horrific skull face. And I love that character, and it was created by this literally insane guy named Fletcher Hanks, who there's been a couple of really interesting books about him and about sort of his relatively disturbing creative process and about and collecting a lot of his stories, which are among the weirdest, he was a writer-artist, so among some of the weirdest written and illustrated stories of the 40s. I think the name of one of them is called I Shall Destroy All the Planets or something. They all have really crazy names.
Good name. Solid.
Post on Phantoma on ericmona.com. That's Erik Mona with a K. And like you can see, like I'd say I answered this question, who's my favorite? It's Phantoma, and here's why, and here's links to all this stuff is like public domain, so all the stories are online. So yeah, there's links to all the stories, and it's just batshit insane. I mean, it is insane. And so I am using the character, not in a super major way. I mean, she doesn't have as big of a role as like Red Sonja or John Carter or anything. But man, like, she's so weird, Louis. I can't.
You just need to. That's the one I'm going to use. I like it.
Yeah, and so I really wanted to use her. I'm enjoying Red Sonja. I mean, how could you not? The character is amazing, especially the version Gail Simone kind of recreated a few years ago, which is what I'm really using as a touchstone for her characterization and what Red Sonja is all about. I love Gail Simone's Red Sonja. I think she did a great job. And I've read a lot of other Red Sonja too. A couple of weeks back, I think I read 70 issues of Red Sonja in one sitting, just like plowed through a whole bunch of trade paperbacks.
Watching online when you're doing the whole class, and what class was she was? You're asking.
Yeah. Now tomorrow I'm about to do the same thing with Tars Tarkas, John Carter's Green Martian buddy. So I gotta read through a whole bunch more, and I've already read through them, but I need to read through the comics specifically with like what's his strength, what kind of powers should Green Martians have, and so. Yeah, starting tomorrow morning, I'm going to sequester myself in a coffee shop until I can start at least having a rudimentary idea of how to pull that off.
You do know that you just told people that as a job, you're going to be looking through comic books to figure out stat blocks to make things cool for your dream job.
I guess I would say as a second or third job. Yeah, I mean, it's like it shouldn't escape anyone's notice that I'm doing this on a Saturday, all day. But yeah, it's great. I mean, it's like for me. I started as a writer, and then as a magazine editor, and then I became publisher at Paizo and chief creative officer. And there's a lot of creative work that I get to do related to that. But I mean, just to kind of take you through my work day today, I got in today in the morning and immediately did a 2-hour job interview for a different non-editorial department, because somebody else is out and one of the other executives is out, so I sat in on a job interview, and then I had a scheduling meeting where we talked about whether this product should be moved, and then I had another scheduling meeting about, how are we going to solve this particular issue to get this product done on time. Then I had a meeting that was all about what is the cadence of business emails that we're going to send to Paizo subscribers and people who are signed up on Paizo.com to let them know about some of the stuff that we're doing. And then I came on to talk to you. And so, like, I've not done a lick of creative work all day. And yesterday was worse. And so to me, getting the opportunity to sit down and just have just a pure RPG design challenge, which is like, okay, how do I do Red Sonja? Super, super invigorating and super, super fun. Not that I don't enjoy the other stuff, but the little kid whose eyes lit up going through Dragon Magazine in 1985 was not thinking about the glory of budget meetings. He was thinking about statting up.
What? You don't like meetings? Who doesn't like meetings?
I mean, I love them, and I'm happy to do them. And, don't get me wrong, that's what I'm paid for to some degree. But, like, I like being creative too, and also there is an element of, like, I don't want to portray myself as an old man or anything like that, but, like, I've been working professionally in RPGs now for 17 years, and I've edited magazines, I've written stat blocks, I've hired people, I've done budget meetings, I've done, but what I haven't done is I haven't statted up Red Sonja. I haven't written a big giant fantasy crossover with a bunch of comics, so I always want to try to keep my life interesting and keep my creative flow going. And if I have to do that kind of on top of my day job, then, as long as I'm having fun with it, I'm pretty excited. Because I know there will come a time, and I may not be the one who gets to decide when that time is, where I no longer have the opportunity to pitch a comic series and write the comic series and, run a miniatures blog every week and pick what miniatures we're doing and set the schedule for a major publishing company, or at least a major gaming publishing company. So it's like, I want to just suck all the marrow out of this stuff while I'm here. Because you never know, one day I may not be doing this anymore. And then I'll probably be sitting there going, oh, I wish when I had the chance, I wish I'd done that, or I wish I'd done that. And I don't, I don't know if it's just my looming midlife crisis talking, but I just don't want to live a life filled with regrets where I say, I wish I did that, or I wish I did that. And it might make me extra tired. It might make me cranky sometimes. And it might mean that I'm making other sacrifices, but what the hell? This is fun, and I'm going to grab onto it with both hands while I can.
Nothing wrong with that. That's a good plan for life. Okay, here's something that I know people want to know, because I mean, most people who watch this are interested about the business side, and everybody wants to know how to break in. I mean, that's always the big thing, and it's to me, it's always like I've told people, look, it's not that difficult, but it's not that easy.
I think that's true. Yeah.
It's one of those things. I think since we all know each other, I mean, let's be honest, everybody knows, and now it's even weirder now because everybody's on the internet. You can find people on Facebook.
Yeah.
Message them direct.
You know people you don't really know.
Right. I have a relationship with a couple artists I've had for nearly 10 years, but we've never met face to face.
Right.
And I think that's kind of how it is now in the industry. People want to come work for Paizo. Everybody wants to. I'm assuming it's pretty much got to get seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it basically, and not just for Paizo. I mean, I think kind of across the board, you've got to be on people's radar to some degree. If we're hiring for a developer and we got 10 applications, 4 or 5 of them are just going to be like, I'm a big fan, but I'm not quite qualified for the job. Then 3 or 4 of them are going to be like, well, I've done work for Lewis Porter, or I've done work for this person or that person. It's like, okay, well, I know this person's worked for Lewis, or I know this person's worked for Green Ronin or something. So I know that they've got a level of professionalism. And then if I needed to, I could reach out to you or Chris Bramus or somebody and say, hey, tell me a little bit about this guy. But if you've done freelance for Paizo and you've hit all your deadlines and then you apply for a job, it's like, yeah, you probably do have a leg up because we know you're a trusted commodity. So one thing that you need to do is you need to get on the radar of the company that you want to work for. And for bigger companies, I think in some ways that's harder, and I think in some ways that's easier. So for example, let's say you want to write for Dungeons & Dragons. Let's say that's your number one goal. Well, Dungeons & Dragons has an organized play program called the Adventurers Guild, and they need writers for their scenarios. So I would recommend that you write scenarios for the Adventurers Guild, and I would recommend that you become known to the people who are involved with that program internally at Wizards of the Coast. Honestly, that's how I got my job at Wizards when I joined as the editor-in-chief of Polyhedron and the runner of the Living Greyhawk campaign in 1999. It was because I'd written for Polyhedron. It was because I'd been to Wizards a couple of times on creative summits because I'd been a top contributor to their Living City campaign at the time. So part of it is finding a way in, sort of doing the thing that you would want to do, which is to say write. Nowadays, again, going back to D&D, they've got that whole DM's Guild program where you can just write products and say it's a D&D product. Well, I have no idea how much the D&D hiring people read through every single one of those products. But if you can go and you can say, I had, 3 products that were in the top 10 for a couple of months or whatever, at least that's speaking a language that they kind of understand. And the Pathfinder version of that is get involved with Pathfinder Society Organized Play, and that's the easiest way to get a freelance writing assignment for Paizo right now. And that's a way to get on our radar. And that's also a way, by the way, to write adventure scenarios, have them played by thousands of people, and there's nothing more humbling than, an internet review of your scenario telling you, oh, this, I actually played this, and I thought this part kind of sucked, and so you can kind of develop your own sensibility of what works and what doesn't work by plugging into a big program that's got an infrastructure, that's got actual players associated with it. That's just one way to do it. Another thing that I would highly recommend to anyone interested in working professionally in the RPG business is I feel very strongly you have to go to Gen Con. You have to be, at least every couple of years, you have to be present. I mean, Nick Logue is a great example of this. Nick Logue is a guy who is probably one of the better known Pathfinder writers. He's subsequently been a guest of honor at PaizoCon. He's a name people recognize. Well, Nick started writing for Dungeon when I was an editor of Dungeon. And for the first year or so that I had any interaction with Nick, he was just that friendly guy from Hawaii who came to the booth and brought us macadamia nuts. You know what I mean? So so the first year he comes up, he's like, oh, hey, I'm Nick. I'm from Hawaii. And I hear, I thought you guys might like these macadamia nuts. So I was like, oh, that's cool. Right, you are. Delicious. And then the next year he comes by and it's like, oh, yeah, you're that guy, Nate, right, with the macadamia nuts, No, it's Nicholas. Oh, right, Nick, and then publish something by him, and then he's a friend. It's like I see people at conventions again and again and again, at our seminars or at our booth. Not that I'm outside the Paizo meeting room much anymore at Gen Con, so I'm probably not in the booth that much anymore, but I see a lot of people again and again, and so that it's easier to make up, oh, right, that's that guy. Oh, that's the guy I had that great conversation about X, Y, and Z. You need to be present. You need to be known by the people who are going to ultimately make the hiring decisions, because at the end of the day, there's not that many jobs in this business. There's certainly not a lot of jobs that are full-time jobs that pay benefits at a company that, will give you any kind of longevity at all. There's a lot of guys like you who are like, I want to be in this business and I'm going to do it my own way and I'm going to run my own thing. And that's another way to do it. You could just say, I don't need D&D. I don't need Pathfinder. I'm going to do my own thing, and I'm going to have a weekly live internet show with a darling little guest star,
Yeah, it's time for bed. See, I'm doing work. Say hello. Yes, you're saying yes, I know.
Who's that?
That is Eric. Eric and I are doing a show. Can you do me a huge favor? Yes, thank you for waving. I do appreciate it. Hey, let me go outside, close the door, and I'll come get you in bed in a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye, Lucas.
Oh.
Bye, Lucas.
Close the door. Close the door.
Okay.
Don't turn the light off. Close the door.
Okay.
Door. Don't be cute. I know you.
That's awesome. But yeah, so anyway, just like, I guess that's it, is be known. It doesn't hurt probably to have some kind of internet presence that is not grossly offensive or, makes people hate you, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And then just be reliable. Get people to depend on you to the point where they need to hire you. Boom. Done.
Here's a question.
Yeah.
What's the worst thing you've done? Like, what's the thing you wrote when you're done? You're like, I don't even believe I wrote that. Why did I do that? I mean, it was a bad piece.
You mean it got published or just the worst?
It got published. It got published. I mean, like I always tell people, my worst thing is I did a source book on dogs. It wasn't.
I've had a lot of things where I write it and then I look at it later, like the next day or something. I go, oh my God, what am I thinking? I think that I contributed a relatively significant amount of design to we did in Dungeon number 112, James Jacobs and I edited a third edition version of Mordenkainen's Fantastic Adventure by Gary Gygax and Rob Coons. And so that was a classic WG5, I think, classic old first edition AD&D adventure. For the 30th anniversary of D&D, we wanted to bring it to third edition. And so we had Gary and Rob made some new contributions, and then James and I also wrote a bunch of rooms and kind of filled out this 4-level dungeon. And I was pretty intimidated to write an adventure, with Gary Gygax, And so I remember the first thing that I wrote was just this like ridiculous, over-the-top, complex trap room with like the walls can squish you, and then the ceiling can fall, and then the floor falls out, and then you go through time. I mean, it's just stupid. So I definitely have reams and reams and reams of just bad ideas that I was smart enough to know were terrible ideas, and that that never saw the light of day, and that I probably just like purged with bleach out of my hard drive so that no one will ever find them. I don't know. There's definitely some things that I wrote that I wouldn't necessarily say that I think were bad or the worst. There's some things I wish I could have done a little bit differently. One thing that I always kind of come back to is there's a scenario that I wrote for Living Greyhawk called River of Blood that I still think is a good scenario, but it had some themes in it that were maybe a little bit more on the adult side than was fully appropriate for a organized play campaign that launched third edition at Gen Con, and so like there was a element of child endangerment in that adventure, like a little kid got kidnapped, and then the way that certain things were written made it easy to construe that maybe there was some abuse going on, like some sexual abuse going on, which was not really the intention at all. But in retrospect, it's like, oh, I can see how you heard that. And so that caused a little bit of a furor. One guy got up in my face at Gen Con and told me how disgusting it was, and it was like Silence of the Lambs. And I was still young enough at the time to kind of appreciate that and say, "Well, wow, what a compliment," But my sense of humor about, especially just having then edited the magazines for a long time and dealt with feedback on various things, I would say my sensitivity about like putting kids in danger is a lot higher now than it was 19 years ago, or whatever it was. And so there's little things like that where it's like, okay, now that I know how people reacted to that thing, I wish I could go back and slightly change the way that I did it. But I'm proud of most of what I've done. I think most of the stuff that I've done I like, and the stuff that I thought was shit I cut out before I put it in public. So you'll never know how bad it can get.
Well, here's something else. I always forget that. When I see you, I was like, I should ask him about this. All the living campaigns, all the stuff that Paizo did what I consider one of the smartest things, developing that out for yourselves as an arm to get people to play the game, which I think is a brilliant idea. Yeah. Third-party guys, we attempted it with JP, and I couldn't do it without JP. He did all the heavy lifting. Mm-hmm. I just stood there and said, try it. It's great. You're going to love it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That seems to be a very difficult thing to do well, and you have done it very, very well for a very long time.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
It's just,
Is there a question, or did you just want to compliment me?
Well, that's a little compliment. Now comes the question.
Okay.
For people looking to do that, even develop something like that, would you even suggest for people to try that? Or is it just like a lot of moving parts?
I think it depends, really. I think my impression is that it's very difficult to have a long-term successful RPG on the scale of something like Pathfinder without a robust organized play. But the scale that something like Pathfinder or Dungeons & Dragons operates on is very, very different than the scale that someone who puts out a PDF once every 3 months or something like that. So I think it really depends on what you need out of it and what you want out of it. And one of the things that's worth considering is what you're basically doing when you launch a organized play campaign is you're kind of setting up a hobby. Yeah, there's a hobby of playing Pathfinder, but the hobby of playing Pathfinder Society is not exactly the same thing. I think one of the benefits of doing it is, I got involved with the RPGA Network back in 1995 because I came back from college, and none of my friends who I'd played D&D with in high school still lived in Minnesota at the time. And so I wanted to play D&D, and I did not have any other way to play D&D but to start going to conventions and getting involved with Living City and RPGA. I don't think I'm unique in that. I think there's a lot of people who either can't find a home group, or people who maybe some members of their home group have drifted to a different game or whatever, their campaign falls apart for whatever reason. As long as there's an ongoing organized play campaign, it's not going to fall apart. It's reliable. But part of the problem is if this becomes people's hobby, and if it becomes a supplement or a substitute to their regular game, there are people who are going to want to play it every single week. There are people who are going to want to play it at least once a month. And unless you have new content coming out, they're going to play through everything in 2-3 sittings, and then they're going to move on to the next thing. So it's a huge commitment in terms of resources to have, we put out 2 scenarios every month for Pathfinder Society. We're looking at how do we ramp up to do something similar with Starfighter. So that in and of itself, just let's assume each scenario is 50 pages. So that's 100 to 150 pages a month. That's more than most people put out for their main game, let alone for something that's meant to supplement their main game. So I've got 3 full-time staff members who work on Pathfinder Society, and if I added a 4th, we'd probably do another scenario a year or a month or something like that, but they would get sucked up right away. I could keep throwing resources at Pathfinder Society forever, and we'd find things for them to do. So you have to be able to fund the effort that it takes to do it regularly. Now, on a smaller scale, could another company do something that was like an adventure every month? Yeah, I think that you could. I think fewer than 1 adventure a month really risks people's attention going elsewhere. If you can play through a whole year's worth of output in a 4-day convention, people will, and so I think that's a challenge. People, and not everybody. There's many Pathfinder Society players who probably play once a year. They only play at Gen Con, or they, whatever. But there are a lot of players who play every week. We have over 500 scenarios for Pathfinder Society now, and there are people who burn through them in 2 or 3 years. Good. And then they're like, can't you do 3 scenarios a month? Can't you do 4 scenarios a month? And that's a real balancing thing you have to do. You have to sort of balance between, well, is this campaign for the 400 people who play every single week, or is this campaign for the 60,000 people who maybe only play a couple of times a year? Mm-hmm. And that is a challenge because those 400 people are also the ones who are writing your scenarios, helping you run conventions, who are your alphas, who are the guys who support the campaign. It's a tough push and pull to try to figure out how to do it right. And I think we're probably helped in some regard by the fact that I have been involved with organized play campaigns, for 21 years at this point in time, going back to the very first one. I basically had my hand either as a player or a coordinator in almost every one that there's been, and so whereas I'm not perfect and I certainly have my own blind spots, and there's probably times where me saying, well, I know the guys in our PFS team probably get tired of me just being pulling up my rocking chair and being like, well, this is how we used to do it in 1998, and so there's probably areas where my expertise is harmful in some ways, but I've seen a lot of stuff in the OP environment, and I kind of feel like I know what's going to work and what's not going to work, and I think it's a daunting challenge, and I think it's a rocket ship that once it takes off, you can almost not get off. But I definitely think it's helped Pathfinder sales. I definitely think Adventurers Guild and Living Forgotten Realms and Living Greyhawk and Living City, I think all those things help Dungeons & Dragons. I would never launch a role-playing game without organized play.
Wow. Okay. Well, then now that you kind of segue, Starfinder.
Yeah.
Okay. Look.
Pretty sweet.
I just want to know. Look, I'm gonna ask for my stuff. I don't care about any of those things. I got some stuff I want to know.
Please.
Spaceship combat. Have you finally got it together?
Yeah, I played it yesterday. We just did an in-house demo of the most recent version of the system yesterday, and oh my god, I had so much fun with it. I really, really, really enjoyed the system. We play tested a little bit of it at Gen Con, so there's some folks out there who've already played it, but I hadn't played it. I'd watched it played a couple of times, and so finally I said, we really need to do a version of this where key members of the staff, so my art director, Sarah Robinson, was playing, our licensing coordinator, Mike Kenway, was playing, and then, of course, the Starfinder team, which at this stage is Rob McCreary, Owen Casey Stevens, James Sutter, and also Jason Keeley, who's one of our editors, who's helping us out as well now, all sitting around the table, and then Jason Bullman, who kind of wrote the rules for the Starship Combat, running us through this battle. And I loved it. It was super, super fun.
Okay, because I know everyone's going to ask, like, there's no sitting around where one person does everything, everyone just sits around and watches.
No, it's much more like, a lot of people will say, just when we're talking about Starfinder in general, is it more like Star Wars or is it more like Star Trek? And, like, thematically and atmospherically and creatively, I'd say it's more like Star Wars, right? It's got a fantastical element that Star Trek sometimes has, but isn't really about. It's about a team of adventurers going to weird different planets and having cool little adventures. Well, that's like both of them. But it's not generally about living on board a capital ship and all that. It's about like living in a Millennium Falcon style vehicle. But when it comes to Starship Combat, I'd say it's much more like Star Trek, in that each player has a role to play within the context of the starship battle. So you've got a guy who's the captain, but you have somebody who's the gunner, and you have someone who's the engineer, and you have someone who's the science officer. And each one of those people can do a different thing during combat. So the science officer is trying to lock on to, the enemy ships, and the engineer is trying to recharge the shields that were blasted away in the previous round. And of course, it leads to a lot of the play around the table. I'm giving it all I can, Captain. That kind of a thing. Right. And then you've got Sarah and I were the gunners. And so Sarah had the port arc and the starboard arc, and I had the turret laser, and we're flying around, and so I didn't really have to focus so much on like, how is the ship going to move this turn? That was Rob, who was the captain, or the pilot. I'm sorry, and the captain kind of gives orders and can give bonuses to different people on different roles, or you can run over to an abandoned station, shove someone out of the way, and be like, I'm going to help with engineering this time, and and there's bonuses and takeaway and negatives to doing stuff like that. It's super fun, and we're all like playing together, and that was the best part about it. I have these nightmares. During the early '90s, I took my D&D campaign on a little bit of a foray into Spelljammer, and there's elements of Spelljammer I really like, but one of the elements of Spelljammer I absolutely hated was the wizard sits down in the spelljamming helm, can't cast spells during the game, is the only one who makes any kind of rolls associated with maneuvering the ship, and then everyone else just stands around and does nothing. Kind of the Birthright had the same thing, where it's like one player is the king. Who's everybody else? Well, a schlub. And so we really wanted to avoid that element with Starfinder, and from playing it and watching it played a few times, I really feel like they've done that. We'll continue to iterate the rules, as we get closer and closer to publication, but it was really fun. And the other part about it was it moved at a pretty good clip, it was exciting. There was a point in time, just to get the full nerd experience here, there was a point in time where we're playing and I pull out my cell phone and I go onto YouTube and I called up Highway to the Danger Zone, because it felt like we were in a dogfight, and then man, it was exciting. I thought it was great. I really liked it.
Okay, that's a good. See, now a little more comfortable, because I like most people like vehicles, and I'm always worried about how to do vehicle rules that everyone gets to play at.
It's tough. It's tough. And I haven't really messed with the vehicle rules for Starfinder much, so I don't know that. Frankly, I don't even know if we're going to have grav tanks and stuff in the core rules. We'll get to that probably down the road, but it's can that be as exciting as Starship Combat? I don't know. Starship Combat kind of by definition, there's a bunch of different stations, and each person has a role. And I can't talk about vehicles beyond starships right now, but man, starships, I think they got it dialed in.
Okay, that's very cool. Very cool.
Yeah, really
all right, and there will be, of course, we know that there will be an OGL for Starfinder.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's being published under the OGL, and what we'll be providing is the Starfinder compatibility license, similar to what we do with Pathfinder. So other publishers will be able to create stuff that works with the Starfinder core, just like they can with Pathfinder. Yeah.
Very, very cool. Well, here, let me let you go, because I know you're still at work, and I've been home trying to relax. I got to put a baby to bed. That's what you do as a father.
All right. Sounds
thank you so much for coming on. I really do.
Thanks so much, and I appreciate the conversation. I would encourage everyone to check out my new ericmona.com website, which is right now mostly about Pathfinder Worldscape. I'll get into weird occult book collecting and more Pathfinder stuff soon, but my focus is really on Worldscape, and that's coming out October 19th, Wednesday, October 19th. So anyone interested can check it out.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming by. I really do appreciate it. I know you've been a very busy guy. Thank you so much.
I definitely have been watching Transparency Agenda vicariously through Facebook, and so it's great to just be a part of it. So it's always nice to see you, Lewis.
All right. Thank you so much. Talk to you later.
All right. Bye.
Bye.